I'm going to share with you 3 pieces of information, and I want you to tell me what is the common ground or the commonality between the 3 things that I'm about to say. The first thing is the prophet Jeremiah in the first reading had the unfortunate mission to tell the Israelites that they were meant to surrender before the invading power. And the Israelites were so unpleased with his message that they put him into a cistern where he almost was left to die because he was covered in mud. The second piece of information is after Pentecost, the apostles went out to preach, and they preached mostly in the Roman Empire, the different territories of the Roman Empire, and they proclaimed that the true Lord of the world was not the emperor, but Jesus Christ, who had died and resurrected. For what they preached, 11 out of the 12 disciples were martyrs. The last piece of information is this. There's a very admirable saint called St. John of the Cross. In the 16th century, St. John of the Cross initiated a reform of the Carmelite order, and he was imprisoned by his own brother Carmelites because they were tired of his message, and he remained imprisoned for 8 months in a dark cell because he wanted to reform for better the Carmelite order. So what is there in common between the prophet Jeremiah, the 12 apostles, St. John of the Cross? What brings them together is that all 3 of them, or all these 3 examples, were people who were set out either to preach the message of God or to do the will of God in their life, and they found conflict, resistance, war, difficulties, imprisonment, even death. Today in the gospel, Jesus says, I have not come to bring peace, but rather I've come to bring division, even within a household. So what's the core message of today's gospel? The core message of today's gospel is whoever is truly set out to be a Christian, to be a disciple of our Lord, and to put his will into practice, guaranteed this person will find difficulties, resistance, conflict in his life. Let me repeat that. The message of the gospel today is whoever is set out to be a disciple of our Lord, he can be certain that the more authentic he is in his discipleship, the more certain he is that he will find conflict, difficulties, and even persecution. Why? Why can't we just be peaceful disciples? Why is it that when we want to be disciples, we're guaranteed difficulties and persecution and conflict? Isn't it possible just to be a disciple and not be bothered by others and not bother anyone else? This is not possible. And let me offer you an image that will help us see why it's impossible. In the heart of each person, in your heart and in my heart, there is an altar. And the altar in our heart is meant to be the place where we offer true praise and worship to God. But sometimes, instead of offering true praise and worship to God, idols take the place of God, and idols remove God from the place of true worship that should take part in our hearts. When someone is determined to do God's will or to preach God's will, what he's doing is he's reclaiming the place of God and throwing away the idols. So he is smashing the idols that's taken the place of God in the altar of our hearts, and he puts God back. But do you know why there is conflict? Because the idols are never happy of losing that place in your heart. Because the idols are never happy when they're thrown away from the altar of people's hearts, and that's why idols reclaim a position in the heart of people. I want to share with you a story from my own life. A moment where I had to face difficulty and trial for my faith. The year was 2007, and I remember I was 17 years old. And I remember that I was having lunch with my father, just the two of us. And I remember that my father asked me, "You're not thinking about being a priest, are you?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And my father said, "Don't even think about it. You got other plans in your life." And I said, "Dad, I appreciate your advice, but soon I'm going to turn 18, and you're not going to decide for me." And I remember that from that conversation to the day that I finally joined the seminary, a whole year went by. And for a whole year, my parents, who loved me dearly, who wanted the best for me, they really made everything that they could to deter me from joining the seminary. And we had difficult moments, difficult discussions, arguments, emotional moments. It was hard for them, and it was hard for me. But I knew that I wasn't going to back down from my decision and from God's will for my life because my parents weren't happy with it. I knew they would understand it in the future. And in fact, that's what happened. Many years later, my parents said, "We're so proud of you, and we're so happy of the decision that you took." But the message that I want to convey today, that I truly think is the main message of the gospel, is you can't be a disciple and expect no difficulties to arise from your discipleship. So let me finish with this question. What difficulties has your faith brought to your own life? What conflicts have you been able to withstand or endure for the sake of your faith? What trials, what discussions, arguments, when is it that you had to stand up for your faith? To stand up for what was true and endure persecution or misapprehension or rejection from other people? When is it that you had to endure this? Because I came up with a good phrase, and this is the phrase: if your faith never brought you trouble, then there's trouble with your faith. Let me repeat this phrase. If your faith never brought you trouble, then there's trouble with your faith. Because faith is problematic in itself. So let me finish with this encouragement. I don't want you going out and looking for trouble. I don't want you going out and looking for conflict, because I think life has enough conflict on its own. But I do have this encouragement. If ever conflict comes your way because of your faith, stand up for your faith. If if problems ever arise because of what you believe in, don't back down. Don't be a coward. Because remember what Jesus says today: I haven't come to bring peace. I've come to bring conflict. 2 against 3 and 3 against 2. So today that we come forward before the altar, today that we come forward before the sacrifice of our Lord, who was sacrificed because of doing the will of the Father, let's be sure that when we receive communion, this communion brings us courage. This communion brings us strength, so that we may endure the difficulties that being a disciple entails. Remember, if your faith doesn't ever bring you trouble, then there's trouble with your faith.